Hello, my name is Brian Smith. I'm a community advisor with Department of Fisheries and Oceans. As a stewardship group, you're probably very familiar with your watershed or the creek that you work on. You may have noticed an area that you consider to be a problem to salmon. That might include a lack of juvenile overwintering, maybe a lack of spawning area, could be a flow problem, maybe a barrier, it could be a number of different things. First thing you're going to want to do is monitor that spot, that area, for at least a year. You want to monitor through all water conditions, weather conditions, and see if it truly is a problem for salmonids. If it is, you're going to want to build yourself a team of partners that can help you with this project and help you move it forward. The first partner that you probably want to establish would be with your community advisor and Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Your community advisor can help build a partnership. They have a team of engineers and biologists that would be willing to help with your project. Other project partners could include First Nations, the province, your landowner, who's probably very key in the project. Most habitat projects that you're going to want to work on will need the permission of the landowner. Industry could be a partner on your team as well. You may have a rail line or something like that running through the area that you plan on restoring. You would want to bring those guys in as part of your team. Planning your project, I suggest that you would include all your teammates, all your partners in the planning stages. Use the professionals to help develop the plans. Those plans are going to be critical in your fundraising stage as well. Review your plans with all your partners. Make sure you do what you say you're going to do. Don't alter your project without including your volunteers and your partners in the changes that you make to any of your plans. You kind of want to plan for failure in an odd kind of way. Make sure that if your project was to go sideways on you, that you're not going to create a worse situation than you had before you started your project. Take a lot of pictures once your project starts. Make sure you're reporting back to your partners as the project progresses. Before your project starts, you will require permits. If it's in-stream work, you do require permits. DFO should be able to help you with those permits and authorizations. These projects tend to be extremely expensive. You will want to research the funding partners and bodies that are out there. Find the future partner that would be suitable for your type of project. The application process can be sometimes taxing. Talk to your CA. Your CA should be able to help you with your funding application. Once your project is underway, take lots of pictures, make sure reporting is done, either sometimes weekly, sometimes every month. Check with your funding partners to see what kind of reporting back they would require for your project specifically. Once your project is complete, it probably isn't complete. You should do a full year of monitoring after your project has been done. Your in-stream works are complete. You want to monitor that project for a complete year to see if the project is doing what you wanted it to do. So monitor for a full year to see if it was successful. The way you're going to know if it was successful, you want to loop back to the monitoring you did prior to starting your project. Is it better or worse than it was before you started?
So welcome to Mosquito Creek in North Vancouver. You're sitting at the site of the Lower Mosquito Creek Restoration Project, which was a project that started 3 years ago, back in 2017, from the North Shore Stream Keepers. With any restoration project, it's important to start with monitoring. And the reason for that is monitoring will help you set goals. What are you trying to achieve with the project? And come post-project time, you're going to find out, hey, where did we exceed and what were our shortfalls? It's also important during your grant writing process to state what your expected outcomes are. That helps build credibility to the project. And come post-project, when you're doing your post-project monitoring, you can see and state, hey, this is what we did, this is how we did it, and how successful you were. If there were shortfalls, you'll know for next time. But most importantly, it's about building a resume and credibility as you move forward to the next project. So the second important piece to any restoration project is collaboration with partners and stakeholders. Here on Mosquito Creek, we've kind of got three adjacent landowners. We've got the City of North Vancouver, Squamish Nation, and CN Railway. It's definitely important to identify all three up front so you're not having issues as you move forward when it comes to things like doing stuff to their land or meeting different policies and guidelines. CN's definitely a more challenging one to work with, but can be a great partner if everything's discussed up front. So it's important to identify those up front. Your project idea might not even be a new idea. It might be new to you, but somebody might have thought about it in the past. In the case of Mosquito Creek here, Squamish Nation had actually hired an engineer to do a rough engineer's drawing of the area. What could be done as far as restoration, what are the limitations, and what could a potential creek look like. We were fortunate to have that drawing up front, which made it really easy for the grant writing process. Built a ton of credibility, and without it, I can definitely say we would not be here today. Beyond collaboration and getting the partners and stakeholders involved up front, communication is key. Every time you reach a milestone along the way, it's important to keep everybody updated and on the same page. The last thing you want to do is go silent on them and have them think that things have come to an end, or maybe you've hit a roadblock. Keeping your sponsors especially up to date is huge, because they want to know that their money is being well spent. So another key component is project planning. DFO is a great resource to get things off the ground and up and running. What you have as an idea isn't really a project until an expert, somebody with experience, says you've got a chance. I was looking at many opportunities further up the watershed, but right away I went and relayed to a restoration biologist with DFO, who brought me down to this site and kind of brought me down to, I guess, what you would call earth, so to speak. I was dreaming a little too big, and he said, well, here's an area with potential. These are what your limitations are. And that gave a lot of confidence. DFO is awesome in giving you kind of a scope of what's possible. And that began the process of grant writing. So continuing with our planning, one must always realize that when you're doing works within a waterway, you're going to need to consult with an expert, one that can produce drawings, produce structures that aren't going to move and be a liability, so to speak. You'll also want to get prepared to go after the permitting. So identify if you're in a tidal reach like this, which is under the authority of DFO, or if you're further upstream, which is all freshwater, then you'll be after a provincial freshwater permit. Another thing to plan for, which can be more challenging, is to plan for hiccups, delays, and roadblocks along the way. I'm speaking from experience. It's not a straight line that's going to go perfectly smooth. You're going to be most likely a little bit all over the place, both emotionally and as far as project timeline goes. So build in a contingency as far as timing, and maybe, recommend a contingency for budget as well. So following on the project planning component, you're going to want to make sure those permits are in place. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have DFO holding the permit, that's great. But if your organization is the one going after the permitting, be sure that you've got that process lined up, whether that's through the province, whether it's through DFO in a tidal reach like this, or perhaps you can even lean on your municipality to help expedite that freshwater permitting process. It's important to know that there's going to be safeguards to protect wildlife. There's nesting seasons for the birds, but there's also fisheries window for the fish. This is typically going to run through August all the way to September the 15th. There are exemptions that can be made, so keep that in mind. This will all help guide your organization on understanding these processes when it comes to things like infrastructure that's being built on the creeks in your area. So you'll be able to have a better understanding of what these windows look like if somebody's doing something that they maybe shouldn't be, and you'll be able to take your knowledge to your municipality and ask the right questions. What's the next step? Well, project funding. Where are you going to get the money to do all these works? And I should say this should actually also be part of your planning process, because different organizations, different grantors have different funding windows. So do you want to be doing a whole bunch of work up front and potentially missing a grant window, or do you want to set yourself up for success, write down the list of grantors and understand, okay, this is when the funding window is, this is when we need something in? That will really set you up for success in the long run. You're going to have different milestones and objectives along the way, many of which are going to cost you money. And it's important to keep track of all those invoices, all those expenses along the way. It's going to save you headache from collecting all those documents later during the reporting process. Another good thing to do is always take photos. Every time you visit the site, changes are going to be happening along the way. So make sure you have really good photos. That will also help in your reporting process. And you can see what a project site like this looked like beforehand and how great it looks today. That will also assist on your future fundings down the line. Another key piece to your funding is going to be a contingency fund. If you are someone or an organization that has done this process before and understands what it takes to, say, purchase logs with roots attached, then you might understand that there's a fixed cost to that, and having a familiarity with where you can go to get them for a flat rate, flat price, that's great. But sometimes, you know, that price is going to change. For me, on this project, many of these logs cost double what was anticipated. And then some of them we actually got in kind or for free. And that's a component that certainly saved the project and saved a lot of headache, kept things on time. So always build in a contingency. I'd say minimum 20% is a good place to start. Post-project monitoring or follow-up monitoring. This is a time to reflect and go back to the monitoring that was done up front, all the documents and perhaps research surveys that were conducted before your works began, and identify what were the goals and did we reach them? Were there any negative outcomes or impacts that we did in doing this project? That's when you're really going to start to see, okay, what were the benefits? And in your grant proposal or in your project proposal, you may have outlined, you know, what are we going to do post-project? How often are we going to conduct our monitoring? Whether that's monthly or annual, or you're like me and you buy a house nearby and you come down almost every day to see how the river's changing and what species, whether they're insects or fish or birds, are utilizing the habitat that you've created. We also have beavers, which can be a good thing in many cases, also a bad thing, or something that causes you grief along the way when you're doing your riparian planting. Post-project monitoring is actually really fun, and it will help you in building material for your next grant writing project. So now you probably have a good idea and you're wondering, well, is this suitable for a project? A quick recap of the steps that you want to take is to start with your pre-monitoring. What does the area look like today? What's the historical data? What are you trying to achieve? Be sure to reach out to the partners, sponsors, stakeholders, identify everyone that could be involved and should be involved in your project. Planning is going to be your next component. Set a timeline, maybe a budget. What's your next steps? How do we get there? And plan for mistakes, hurdles, roadblocks along the way. Permits, so things like, is it a freshwater permit that you're applying for? Is it a tidal water permit through DFO? Which municipalities or levels of government can you lean on to help maybe take that on your behalf instead of your organization doing it yourselves? And then funding, that's the big one. So identify which sponsors, which grantors you're going after, what their timelines are to get those grants in so you can meet their funding windows. And then lastly, now you've got all your money, you're spending it, be sure post-project that you're doing some follow-up. Follow-up is huge. It's going to allow you to build a resume and move on to your next project, or perhaps, like in this case, we're moving into phase 2, which is riparian vegetation. So we've conducted all the in-stream work, but a huge component of this is, okay, well, how do we make it look aesthetically pleasing? And maybe a motivation to this is, let's put in native plants in before the invasives take over.
This session is going to be about the Salmon Enhancement Program, Public Involvement Program, and Community Economic Development Program, our PIP and CEDP's grants and contributions. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land we are presenting from is the traditional and unceded territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation, whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. Thank you for spending time with us and welcome. Who are we? Well, this session will be brought to you by Carolyn DeJong.
And I'm Dickie.
You may best know me from my time in the officer position, but now you get to hear a little bit more about some other things that I've been focusing on. Catherine here will walk you through one of our contribution templates a little bit later and how to complete them. So together, we actually make the double CD team. So what is a contribution agreement and why are we using them in SEP? Well, a contribution agreement is basically a funding mechanism utilized to advance reconciliation, partnerships, collaboration to achieve salmon enhancement programs, objectives, and priorities. It is a mechanism that enables and engages skills, capacity, expertise, and resources outside of fisheries and oceans. It's an agreement using contribution funds and not a contract using operational funds. So there's two different colors of money, just so that you're aware of that. And it does not result in an acquisition of goods, services, or assets directly to the Government of Canada. So if you're interested in statistics, here's a couple for you. Did you know? According to the 2019-2020 public accounts in the internet, government-wide, $243.3 billion accounts for all of government expenditures. For DFO, GNC expenditures totaled $279 million that same fiscal year, which is up 60% from the year prior. So the reality is, GNC funds aren't going anywhere. They are here to stay. This is the way that we're supporting communities, and consequently, we're doing our best to make sure those processes are efficient and effective as possible. So contribution agreements are subject to numerous authorities. Grants and contributions in SEP are a transfer payment program, or a TPP, if you will. We'll try and be careful of all the acronyms and make sure we spell them out because we have quite a few of them. So in short, a transfer payment is one of the government's key instruments in furthering its broad policies and objectives. It's literally a transfer of monetary payments within a program. So in essence, a TPP is the ability to transfer a payment to a recipient that furthers the program's policies and objectives. So we've got a little bit of a list here that some of you may or may not be aware of. There's a policy on transfer payments, sets out the expected results and consequence for non-compliance, sets out roles and responsibilities at high levels, Treasury Board Secretariat, deputy heads, ministers, etc. There's a directive on transfer payments, seeks to operationalize the policy on those TPPs, sets out requirements for terms and conditions. Then there's a guideline on the directive of transfer payments, which helps give additional context, interpretation, detailed explanations of key requirements, things like reporting, monitoring, auditing, cash management, etc. It actually helps link the policy to the directive. And then there's several others, such as Financial Administration Act, etc., etc. So the reason I show you all this is just to demonstrate that there's actually several reasons why we ask for the things that we do in regards to your agreements. We need to ensure that we're compliant to the conditions that are all set and all the various clauses that are in your agreements and the structure of work plans and financial tables and reporting. all help us meet these authorities, these reporting requirements, and the guidelines. And where do all the contribution funds go? Well, many of you may know where the funds are directed in your immediate area, but the SEP funds are spread across BC to various nonprofit groups. So in this slide, on the graph to the left with the columns, we show the breakdown of our two streams. The Community Economic Development Program, our CEDPs, are shown in blue. It's worth 3.2 million. And the Public Involvement Program PIPs are in orange and worth $500,000. There's a few little short ones in there that you can just barely see, but they're there. So the total of funds dispersed is 3.8 million annually. Now on the right, we show what kinds of activities are being supported in your agreements. Now what's important to me here, looking at the graph, is that you folks spend almost the same energy on stewardship as you do with enhancement. We are not just raising fish, but the Community Involvement Program spends a huge effort on stewardship. And for that, thank you so much. Like, this is such a good time right now just to say what incredible work you do in your local areas. There's outreach, we've got education, you've got kids and citizens engaged in your creeks and your rivers around you. The list is vast, it goes on, but your creativity and energy, even during the pandemic, actually especially during the pandemic, it's been incredible. The new media that's been available, your websites are becoming very prolific, your social media and your virtual connections, they're strong as ever. So thank you for all your efforts, even despite all the constraints that we've been experiencing in the last short while.
Recipient proposals. In respect to an application process or a proposal process, as for the previous slide with the graphs, it should be noted that SEP's annual GNC funds are already allocated in the region. SEP is one of many programs in Pacific region that are funding projects using GNCs in such a way to best support their program goals and objectives. So you may find that one program's process will vary from another program. And for SEP, in the event that there are additional funds available in CIP, the process would start by completing a template for a new proposal, which will eventually become appended to your official agreement. Your proposal will be negotiated with your local community advisor, and a final project work plan will be documented on that template, and we call it Schedule B. So Schedule B must include a project overview, description, and outcomes. So the overview will tell us who the recipient is, where they are located, what the project goals and objectives are, and expected outcomes. It basically provides an overall summary of the project. The project description includes an outline of the specific work, the tasks, the activities, the methodology that will be used to implement the project, and it should provide a clear understanding of the logical steps of the project. And then the project outcomes will identify exactly how your project will align to steps, objectives, and priorities. Following that, we have the annual work plan activities. They'll be recorded under one of four options as they directly relate to, again, if you recall on the pie graph slide, salmon enhancement, restored or enhanced habitat, salmon stock assessment information, and or public stewardship. So the proposal may include all four of those activities, or it might only be one or two. In each or all of those activities that a recipient may have in their proposal, it would require further details and to be broken down into the overall cost of the activity, start and end dates of the activity, and a description, followed by the specific task to be accomplished, and then finally ends with what the deliverables or performance confirmation is required at the end of the project. Finally, your proposals should give us an overall financial breakdown of how the funds will be utilized. So the template contains a table showing all of the eligible expenditures that funds may be spent on. You will see this table in great detail when Catherine jumps in next, so I'm not going to get into it here. It will also have a table to which you will estimate approximately how much of your funds will be spent each month, their Schedule B. And that would naturally correspond to what activities and tasks you plan to accomplish over the course of the year. This proposal will be reviewed to ensure it meets the objectives, that the work is achievable within your timelines and within your budget, as well as ensuring that expenses described are eligible, etc., stuff like that. So while SEPGNC funds are fully allocated, I'm sure there are those of you in this session that have been part of other sessions this weekend and have also seen or heard about other DFO programs that are sharing funding opportunities that are currently happening. And of course, the new Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative is coming. So there are other exciting opportunities now and in the future that may help support your community projects. And again, GNCs are not going anywhere anytime soon. So you will be getting quite familiar with proposals and reporting processes over time should you choose to get involved in other funding opportunities. And another note I wanted to make sure is always know we are here to help. So anyone that's like looking for proposals to come forward, there's always going to be a contact person and a way to get more information to help you through the processes. So don't be afraid to reach out.
Okay, so next slide is what is the contribution agreement lifecycle? And I know this is a really big wordy slide. Please remove any sharp objects from your desk, refrain from jabbing yourself with them. Or, this might take me maybe 2 minutes to get through this. So if you want to set a timer and take a little break, you can do that too. Otherwise, stick around. And if you have questions as we go through the slide, please type them in the chat. Somebody will do their best to help answer them. And for the most part, you'll probably be familiar with a good chunk of this slide. So here we go. Some of our steps that we go through: planning. So right off the bat, essentially communicating with your community advisor and our section head in the planning and priorities for the fiscal year. So basically creating a map of what the year will hold for you. And then your new Schedule B template work plans will need to demonstrate how the project meets DFO SEP objectives and priorities. And once you and your community advisor are satisfied with the project and deliverables, you can submit it. Then the regional SEP team will acknowledge the new Schedule B proposals have been received and what the status of funding approval is. Number 4 is assessment. So proposals will go through an audit, evaluation, and formatting process, and any questions or concerns will be addressed at that point. With any questions resolved, the section heads will be requested to approve the agreement to proceed for signatures by the recipient. And with those approvals complete, the recipient receives the agreement. They will always sign the agreements first. When the recipient returns their signed agreement, then SEP administration has to obtain the area director's signature, submit it to administrators, create required financial documentation in the new SAP financial system. SAP stands for System and Applications Program. It is brand new to DFO, and we're working out the bugs this early in the fiscal year. And finally, we gain electronic approval to release the advanced payments. As the year moves along, it's important to keep in touch with your community advisors. Let them know what's going well and what's on track. It's always nice to hear successes and have some exciting news that comes down our way. So let them know what's going well and let them know if you're experiencing unforeseen circumstances that they may want to do an adjustment or an amendment or maybe reallocate some expenditures. It's a really good time, just as you're working through the year, just to regularly check in with your community advisors. And then every year end, the Schedule E report is required to be completed at a minimum, along with other deliverables specified in your performance confirmation. So there are detailed slides to follow that Catherine will walk you through to help you understand that report. And when community advisors are satisfied with the report and the deliverables, they get submitted for audit and approval. So finally, there's a closeout. With section head approval, any holdbacks can be released and Catherine can close your agreement in our systems. So I know that's a lot to take in. Your 2 minutes are up. The message I want to leave you with is that it's really important to be communicating well together. So community advisors down and recipients communicating back. It's a real ebb and flow. We're trying to balance our work and life and balance all the requirements that we showed you earlier with all the steps that we need to take in a process. So together, we want to work hard with you to make this as smooth as possible. And finally, for me, what is this information used for? We report nationally on our delivery of SEP GNC funds. For example, who did the funds go to? How many recipients were engaged? What kinds of activities did those funds support? The information helps SEP make informed decisions and demonstrate the community engagement in the region. And SEP contribution agreement information can contribute to the annual report, as evidenced here by the 2019-2020 report cover that SEP has been working on. So there's a picture of the report cover there and is available online. So bottom line is SEP needs to tell its story. It's hard for SEP to tell a story without information that's collected and gathered consistently, transparently. So Schedule E's help us with this. This information is helping us put together reports that will communicate locally, regionally, nationally, all across the board. So without further ado, and with that segue, I'm going to turn this over to Catherine, and she's going to walk you through some more details of your Schedule E information.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for all that very important and valuable information. I feel it gives us a better understanding of why we do the things we do and why we ask for the information we ask for.
So this part of the presentation will be on how to prepare your Schedule E. Schedule E is your year-end reporting that you will find at the end of your signed contribution agreement. So when you're flipping through your agreement, this will be found on the last 4 or 5 pages. So some may recognize this. There are some updates and changes that we've made, hopefully, to make the whole process a little bit easier for everyone. Please do keep in mind that each GNC funded program has a slightly different look and feel. The SEP GNC program will require different reporting requirements compared to, say, those of BCSHRIF. This presentation is specific to SEP GNC reporting. So let's get started. At the top of your Schedule E, you'll find information box with the majority of it being filled out for you already. The fiscal year, agreement number, legal name of recipient, and the amount of approved contribution total will already be completed for you. The part that you will need to complete is the amount of funds received in fiscal year. This will be the amount of your advances, less any holdbacks. Now, the type and purpose of report will only be found on CEDP agreements. So in this, you'll be selecting the type of reporting that you are submitting. I personally only see the year-end reports, whereas you might be submitting a progress report to your community advisors. And the purpose of the report is important, especially if you're getting paid out quarterly. Something that I find when reviewing the submitted Schedule E's is that not a lot of people know how to put an X in a checkbox. You're thinking to yourself, X in checkboxes sounds silly, but Bill Gates has more money than I will ever see in my entire life, so he must know what he's doing. This is something that's very convenient, simple, and easy to master. What you need to do is hover your cursor over the gray box, click your right mouse button. This will bring up the first menu that you'll see on the left, giving you several options. Select Properties from this menu, which will bring you to the Checkbox Form Field Options menu. Now, that's a mouthful. In just about the middle of that box, you'll see the option to change the default value. When you first open this dialog box, it auto-populates to not checked. So to have the X appear in the checkbox, click on the circle beside the checked default value and press OK. These gray boxes pop out throughout your Schedule E, and now you'll know how to fill them in. So in section 1 of your Schedule E, you'll find a very familiar looking table. That is, of course, the one working with your community advisor on the GNC. The information in Table 1.1, Categories of Eligible Expenditures, comes directly out of your signed contribution agreement. This is the part where we want to know where the money was spent and how you use the GNC funds. The proposed budget column will be completed for you from the information in your signed agreement. This is why it's important when working with your community advisors to create your New Year's Schedule B and Ds, you ensure your proposed budget from your agreement is as accurate as possible. An example on how to complete this. So to make the math easy, say your agreement, you propose a budget of $10,000 in salary and wages. This amount appears in the proposed budget column. In the description cell, you would outline how those funds were spent. Say you hired a biologist for part of your project. You would put in something like project biologist, 100 hours at $100 an hour, including benefits. Then in the actual expenditures DFO only column, you would put $10,000. When filling in the column for salary and wages, you want to make sure you don't put in names, rather job or position titles. Another example would be, say you purchase insurance from Pacific Streamkeepers Federation for your hatchery and volunteers. In the insurance associated with the project activities row, the proposed budget amount would again be already completed for you from your agreement. You would need to add a description in the expense description column, and then the actual expenditures DFO column would contain the amount from the invoice. Something to keep in mind when completing this table is that what we are looking for here is a breakdown of where the funds that were provided for this particular contribution agreement were spent. We completely understand that it takes more to run your project or facility, but what we need to know is the amount that you receive from SEP and how it was spent. So having said that, the total at the bottom of the proposed budget column and the total at the bottom of the actual expenditures DFO only column needs to be the same. In table 1.2, which is titled All Sources of Support, the first line will already be completed for you with the amount, again, this coming from your final signed agreement. You'll see in this slide that there's a drop-down menu in the type column. To get to this menu, you'll need to check your cursor into that cell, and then the gray box will appear with the down arrow giving you the options for federal, provincial, municipal, or other. Select whichever one best suits your needs. If you receive other funds from DFO, say your project is working with stock assessment, you'll need to put that amount and a general description on a separate line. Your projects are all very important, and it is valuable to know what type and amount of support is important to make your project a success. Table 1.3, Ledger of Expenses, looks like a lot of information is required, but in essence, we're looking for where you spent your SEP funding. You can provide this information in a financial report like QuickBooks or even an Excel spreadsheet. You can complete the table 1.3, adding lines as needed. For this table, you'll want to make sure the amount in the total of eligible expenditures dollar amount column is equal to the amount of your agreement. If you're splitting an invoice or receipt between your SEP contribution agreement and another funding source, you would put that amount going to SEP DFO in eligible expenditures, and the second part into the non-SEP portion of invoice column. The total for that invoice or receipt would then go into total invoice amount. So if you're splitting an invoice, the amount for total invoice amount will actually be more than what your agreement is. Table 1.4 and 1.5 will only appear in CEDP agreements. Table 1.4, capital acquisitions, is where you want to enter any single purchase that is $10,000 or more. So if you've budgeted to purchase a new or new-to-you vehicle, you would include that amount in this table. For table 1.5, budget deviations, this is where you would show where you made changes to your proposed budget over 10%. Now these are changes to the expense categories all the way back in table 1.1. Say you'd underestimated how much it would cost for you to build some signage due to the crazy, outrageous, ridiculous price of lumber right now. So instead of your signs costing you, say, $1,000 to make, like you had budgeted, they're now going to cost you $2,500 to make. In table 1.5, you would enter that information for the over budget. Be sure to keep in contact with your community advisor to make them aware of the deviation and whenever possible, get their prior approval. Section 2 brings us out of the financial part of the Schedule E, so feel free to put away your calculators and breathe a sigh of relief because the math is done. In this section, the performance confirmation will have been taken from your signed agreement and pre-filled into this table. Each activity in your agreement will show up here. For these activities, you'll need to check which one of the gray boxes best fits the status of your deliverables. And we know how to do that now, so good on us. So if you've checked a box in table 2.1 that says an activity was canceled or delayed, you would enter that explanation into table 2.2 activity deviations. For example, if your facility usually tours a local school during spawning season, but due to COVID, everyone stayed home, you would enter that information here. Table 2.3 will appear in both CEDP and PIP agreements. In this example, I clipped the table of a CEDP agreement. Here we're looking to see the number of partners or individuals that supported your project and the number of outreach events you supported. We use these numbers to produce the annual report that Carolyn alluded to earlier in this presentation, as well as respond to mandatory national and regional reporting requests. The more accurate information they're able to collect here, the better picture we are able to paint, which helps demonstrate the impact of your groups in your communities all over BC. Section 3, recipient confirmation, the last piece of your Schedule E. If you have the capability to print, sign, scan, and return your schedule, you would complete option 1. If you choose to save a tree and sign electronically, you would again use the gray checkbox and insert your digital signature. To be considered complete and to release any holdbacks, or to initiate a payment for the second year of your agreement, if applicable, this last page needs to be signed. I would have to say that over 80% of the Schedule E's that I review are completed correctly, so well done all. As Carolyn said at the beginning of the presentation, G's and C's seem to be the way the government is now doing business. So we want to make sure that SEP reporting process is as hopefully pain-free and efficient as possible.
So with that, Carolyn and I would both like to extend our heartfelt thanks to all the community groups
for working so hard with your community advisors to complete your Schedule E's. We appreciate your involvement and thank you for your continued efforts in enhancing your local salmon, restoring habitat important to not only salmon, but also other species, participating in stock assessment activities, and raising the public's awareness through many very imaginative activities. Thank you all for joining us and enjoy the rest of the presentations.
Thank you.
I'm Jim Shinkewski, the Director of Grants and Community Programs at the Pacific Salmon Foundation in Vancouver. Today I'd like to take a few minutes from this session and discuss project planning and funding and help you gain a perspective from the funder side of things as to how to best develop a project concept and write a proposal and have the greatest chance of success in terms of having your project funded and delivered effectively. Thanks to the organizers of today's session. I appreciate this opportunity to speak, and I miss seeing you all in person, as this is the first and hopefully the only virtual SEP conference that is in the cards for us, but I'm happy to be here nonetheless. Firstly, in developing a project concept, it's important to frame your project in terms of a greater picture. Strategy is important, and you have to ask yourself if your project fits a larger strategy or is it part of a watershed plan or a recovery plan. Of course, there are a lot of one-off projects if you need to purchase some materials or replace a generator. This isn't necessarily a large strategic plan, but if you're developing a habitat restoration or a large-scale sustained education program, you need to think on the strategic side and make sure that this fits the greater picture. There are a lot of organizations doing a lot of work out there, and we want to make sure that what you're doing is complementary to what's being done by others. So consider what else has been done before that your project might be able to improve on or to enhance. It's important through conferences such as this to reach out to your peers and to discuss and compare projects and ideas and make sure not only that you're not duplicating works that have been attempted or completed in the past, but also to make sure that you're working collaboratively as much as possible. There aren't a ton of resources out there, but it's important that what we're doing is as cost effective as possible and as effective for the fish and the fishery resources possible. Along with that, when you're developing your project concept, you want to consider if you're responding to a new or an imminent problem. This ties back to being in touch with your peers and your community advisors and other agencies and funders that might have some history on the area or on a project idea and might be able to shed some additional light on it. And as much as you're excited about your project idea, it might be worth considering asking yourself, is your group the right one to take this on? You might be a new group and trying to feel around and see what you're best at and where you could be most effective. Or you could be a seasoned group that's really good at one thing, but not so experienced at trying something else, whereas other groups have been doing it for years and years and might have a lot of experience you can draw on, or the aptitude and the capacity to do that work themselves. Just something to consider as you're going along. You're not alone in this landscape. There are others who have done similar work in the past, possibly, and might be willing to help your project in the future. Next up is putting your application together. We suggest that you find as many potential funding sources as possible, and not only because none of them are guaranteed to be successful, but you want to have a coalition of partners who are able to contribute different eligible funding sources. For example, if you need a lot of money for wages, there are certain foundations or private donors that would be willing to fund that, whereas someone like the Pacific Salmon Foundation isn't able to do so in many situations. So it's good to have as many partners available for those reasons. Also, it's important to double check your timelines, not only the deadline for submitting your application, but the payout timelines. For example, with the Pacific Salmon Foundation, applications can have a lag of up to 4 months between submission and payout. So you want to make sure that your project, if you need the money urgently, is funded in such a way that this timeline isn't going to be a major hindrance. As well, you need to keep an eye on the timing elements of your project, like the fisheries window or equipment availability or any number of other factors that have strict and determined timelines that'll affect the success of your project's implementation within your original planned window. Another thing to keep in mind is the scalability of your project. Sometimes a project could be awarded partial funding, and your project will have to be modified to accommodate that, multi-phased over several years, or having one element that could be done at the expense of sacrificing another element, or reshifting your expense items to accommodate multiple funders, each contributing part of the budget instead of the entire budget as originally planned. And talk to the staff at the organization that you're applying for funding for. I know we get a number of calls at the foundation for people who need help with their application or just want to bounce ideas off it for eligibility or effectiveness. These are really helpful conversations for us as well. So we are always willing to take your call, and we're always willing to help. And I know that a lot of our sister foundations and funders are very willing to help in the same way. So please reach out to us. We're here to help. Once the review process is complete, you'll receive a notification with one of 3 possible outcomes. You were completely successful, 100% funded. Congratulations. Time to collect your funds and begin your work. Second is you were not successful. This happens. We are always oversubscribed, as are most foundations and funding agencies, so not every project is going to receive the best possible outcome. Some, not a lot, will not be receiving any funding at all for that intake. Now, along the way, we want you to be successful. We help as much as possible. For example, if there's something they're seeing from your application that we think could provide some detail or some clarity, we will ask other knowledgeable reviewers or experts to look at it and give us their opinion, or we'll come back to you and say, hey, can you address these couple of concerns we have? Our review's coming up and we want your application to have the best shot at success that there is. Or we'll ask you for some supporting documents. As well as we're going through your applications, we will make little corrections to math or typos or clarity to help push it along and give it a nudge in the hopes that it will be successful. So we're there, we're working for you, even though it doesn't work out all the time. Your application is carefully stewarded along the way and given the best chance of success. If you're not successful, feel free to come back to us and say, what can I do differently? What happened to my application? And we will help you with that and help you craft it for a resubmission if that's tenable, or help direct you to other funding sources that might work best for you. So, with your grant approval in place, it's time to get to work. You need to collect your funds, and every foundation and funder will do this a little bit differently. Some will pay 100% of it up front and send you on your way. Some will pay in increments with a holdback at the end. Make sure that your cash flow is arranged in such a way that your project can accommodate whatever payment style the funder has in place for their program. Once your work is done, you might need to submit a final report. This is something important to keep an eye on. It allows the funder to collect metrics and gauge success, as well as to kind of gauge demand and what might be coming down the pipe in terms of what work is being done in what areas and how we can best be prepared for it. If you have changes to your budget along the way, with PSF at least, just let us know. We can approve reallocations based on shifting circumstances. As we saw with COVID over the past year, about half of projects had to change their timing or a little bit of the scope of their work or some of their expense items because everything was upside down and projects needed to shift in order to be successful in a weird year. But we're here to help again, and we've had a lot of success with that despite the obstacles. As well, your project might require some planning for the future. It might require some long-term or short-term monitoring. You might need funding support or a work plan for that. It might need maintenance if it's a high energy or a potentially unstable system or a series of works. And these need to be planned for and funded and accommodated into the future. Again, these are things that Pacific Salmon Foundation can help with, and we're happy to discuss with you the long-term success of your project and what work might need to be done to keep it viable. That's a very brief overview of the project cycle as it winds its way through the Pacific Salmon Foundation from concept to post-project follow-up and final report submission. I hope this has been helpful, at least to peek under the hood of how things work on the funding side of things. If you ever want to discuss any of your project concepts with us, we're happy to discuss it and see how it might best fit and how we can accommodate it and how we can help. If not through us, then through another funding agency that it might be well suited for as well. We all talk to each other and we all try to work together, and we are here to help. So I look forward to our discussions in the follow-up to this session and any questions you might have. Thanks very much.
Hello, SEP community. Thank you for asking me to be a part of your community workshop. My name is Suzanne Thorpe, and I'm a senior program officer and biologist working in the BCSHRIF program. I'd just like to acknowledge that I live, work, and enjoy the outdoors in the shared lands of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Squamish First Nations. My presentation today is about the Government of Canada's grants and contributions funding, as well as the BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund program. So just to get started, I'm going to present a little bit about the Government of Canada's grants and contributions, then give you an overview of the BCSHRIF program, as well as some key updates. I'd also like to give you a couple of examples of our ENGO-led projects. We'll discuss how you can get funding and talk very generally about some of the upcoming priorities. For further discussion or questions, and since this presentation is virtual, I'll leave you with our program contact information, and should you wish to get further information or to connect with us at BCSHRIF, please do so. So I'm going to start with a bit of a 101 on government grants and contributions. Transfer payments are a large part of the Government of Canada's spending. The transfer payment is a mechanism to transfer money or goods, services, or assets to other governments or third parties in order to achieve results that are meant to improve the lives of Canadians and benefit society while achieving the government's broad policy objectives and priorities. Grant and contribution funding is approved by Cabinet through the Treasury Board. So every transfer payment program has a set of terms and conditions that outlines the program's design, so kind of like who the funds are for, what the funds can be used for, and how the money can be spent. And they also establish conditions for the transfer payments using a bit of a risk-based approach. It's worth noting that there's a difference between grants and contributions. A grant is a transfer payment that has pre-established eligibility rules, and a grant is required to have reasonable certainty that the funds will be used by the recipient for the specified purpose. It's not subject to being accounted for by a recipient, nor normally subject to an audit by the department. So a grant recipient might be required to report on results, but the department does not require the submission of financial reports. So it could be something for an arts day or a performance day, or funding for events such as Oceans Day or other types of nominal funding. A contribution, on the other hand, is a transfer payment that's subject to specific performance conditions that are outlined in a funding agreement. So contribution programs have pre-established eligibility criteria, performance conditions, which are financial and non-financial, and they're subject to audit by the department. Program spending under a contribution agreement has to be accounted for, and the performance results have to be reported on. The program's terms and conditions, which I mentioned, those help determine whether or not a grant or a contribution is the best fit for any program. So it's worthwhile noting that in 2021, almost 700 active contribution agreements in British Columbia, and that they represent $130 million across 48 programs. The Grants and Contributions program that I work in is called the British Columbia Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund. The fund was jointly launched by the Honourable John Horgan, the Premier of British Columbia, and the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, the former Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard, on March 15th of 2019. It is a contribution fund of over $142.85 million over 5 years, and the program currently extends until March of 2024. The federal government provides about 70% of the funding for the program, and the rest, the other 30%, comes from the province of BC. There was a first call for expressions of interest that closed on April 15th, 2019, and under that round of funding, 42 projects were funded. A second round of funding with expressions of interest closed on September 15th in 2020, and the minister approved just over 50 projects to proceed to negotiations on May 7th of this year. This will expend most of the program's financial allocation. In terms of the scope and focus of the program, the BCSHRIF program is focused on restoring and protecting Pacific salmon and their habitats, improvements in the BC seafood sector, modernizing wild fisheries and the aquaculture sector, and ensuring resiliency in the face of climate change and our current economic conditions. If you'd like more specific details on our program's priorities, I'll invite you to take a look at our website or connect with our program staff. BCSHRIF supports projects focused on what we call our 3 program pillars. These are science partnerships, innovation, and infrastructure investments. So I'm going to give you examples of projects that are innovative and focused on restoring and protecting vulnerable Pacific salmon species and their habitats. And I'm going to highlight 2 of the projects that received program funding in the first round of the BCSHRIF program. The first of these projects was approved in round 1. The Comox Valley Project Watershed Society was successful in obtaining a contribution agreement for $372,000. The photos at the top of the page are of surf smelt, Pacific sand lance, and sand lance eggs, which are attached to little grains of sand. The photo at the bottom is one of the beaches that was sampled for this project. This project included the use of citizen science to undertake field sampling along some of the sandy beaches near Comox. The Society was able to identify 6 new locations where forage fish are spawning, and these were previously unknown, and they have worked to map and quantify these important forage fish populations and their habitats. This work supports the enhancement and conservation of Chinook salmon in coastal BC. So the second group that was successful in receiving a contribution agreement is the Baker Creek Enhancement Society, and they received $750,000. So the Baker Creek Enhancement Society is undertaking riparian restoration work in the Nazco Plateau, which is an area that's located near Quesnel, British Columbia. So for this project, the Society assessed, prioritized, and commenced planting of riparian areas which were heavily affected by forest fires. There's a couple of shots of the forest fires at the top of the page. The work is being undertaken to address the degradation of upslope areas and to prevent sedimentation and further habitat damage to downstream spawning and rearing areas for salmon. So one of the big questions you may have is, how do I get funding? I've got a couple slides here on funding. First, I'll talk a little bit about the application process and the requirements. So most programs have a competitive application process, and they're usually either a one-step or a two-step process. And what I mean by that is, a one-step process is when the application is submitted, and that is the only information used to determine if the project will be successful. A two-step process is what BCSHRIF uses. So prospective recipients submit a summary proposal as an expression of interest, and then the project scope is evaluated and reviewed, and then the eligible recipients receiving high scores, which I'll discuss in a second, are invited to then submit a full proposal, which also undergoes an evaluation process. I should probably also mention that a few programs are invitational only, but those programs would target specific areas, specific groups, or economic sectors. All programs have eligibility criteria. The program usually specifies the applicant type, so it might be open to an NGO, to industry, First Nations, or others, or it might be activity related. So, for example, the project, they may be requesting projects specific to fish habitat restoration or specific to community hatchery improvements. Projects are determined to be eligible if they align with the program's priorities. So for BCSHRIF, the project must also be linked to one of its overall funding pillars. There are often stacking requirements, or often referred to as stacking limits for government funds. So it could be that 50% of a project must come from sources outside of the government, or programs might have preferred stacking limits, which gives priority to recipients coming in with a certain percentage of matching funds. There may also be partnership requirements for funding and also for in-kind supports. As well, if the project is being undertaken on the shared lands of First Nations, the program may wish to see that there are letters of support from those First Nations in place that would enable the project to proceed. Programs will also want to know if there is capacity within your organization for project management. So this includes financial and project management, as well as project reporting. There's some key things to think about, and one of those things is you'll really want to think about the content of your application. You'll want to pay particular attention to the details of the process and the application requirements, or else you might get kicked out of the process. These are usually posted online, and what you should really consider is what your priorities are. So ensure that your priorities align with priorities of the grants and contributions program you're applying for. So you want to make sure you very specifically address how you will meet their key priorities or areas of focus, and how you will tangibly support the outcomes relating back to those priorities. So many grants and contribution programs also have optimal funding amounts that they distribute, or a maximum total amount. So keep that in mind, as it might also play into your project scoring. The key really is to clearly explain what you're doing and the benefits that you're going to achieve for fish, for the community, for the region, or province. And whether that's environmentally, socioeconomically related, or otherwise. So with regard to the project leveraging and partnerships, keep in mind that leveraging and partnerships benefits your application. If a project is supported 100% by a program like BCSHRIF versus having other funding sources in place, there's an increased risk to the program if things go sideways. So it reduces the government's risk if you kind of have skin in the game. In terms of other resources, whether or not they're financial or in kind, that kind of support can be sought from government entities and crown corporations, industry and business funds, or other NGOs. There's also the possibility that there might be DFO support for your project, so talking to your community advisor is a really good place to start. Again, having the support of a local Indigenous community is key, and they may be interested in providing additional funding or in-kind support or otherwise participating in your project for capacity or community building within your area. Something to caution, pay attention to your project timelines. Your project will need to fit in within the program's lifetime. You should also be aware of what permitting you will need and the time frames required to make applications and to receive those permits or approvals on time to do the work you want to do. One of the last things I'll discuss about the project application process is the scoring of your project. It's important to note that projects are scored and that it's a competitive process. Many programs are oversubscribed, and so projects ultimately end up being ranked, and the ones that align best with the program are the ones that are likely to receive funding. For BCSHRIF, we have 5 scoring categories. The first is the proponent qualifications and their record. So by record, we mean whether or not they've received any other contribution agreements from the government and whether or not those were successfully completed. The second is project feasibility. Then we've got cost effectiveness, whether or not the project aligns with BCSHRIF, DFO, and British Columbia priorities, and then the relevance and scale of the project. So those items which achieve broader benefits for society as a whole, such as employment or things like that. One of the things I should mention is that BCSHRIF strives really hard to ensure that there's fairness and transparency in the scoring of our projects. So we ask subject matter experts to help us evaluate a project, and all of the feedback that we receive is considered when we're developing the joint funding recommendations that we submit to the minister. It's worth mentioning that programs do have different scoring mechanisms and that there may be some other considerations that come into play when we're scoring your projects. And they might include things like the sustainability level of your project, whether or not you meet stacking limitation preferences, the value for the dollar spent, how much employment will be generated, or how many partnerships might be gained through your project. So in terms of 2021 and what's upcoming for BCSHRIF, there are some upcoming considerations. In the 2021 federal budget, the federal government committed an additional $100 million for the BCSHRIF program. As well, the provincial government has also made mandate commitments to expand their program, and the Premier has also announced additional support for BCSHRIF in his election platform. So while we don't have a crystal ball, we think that our program is likely to continue to address key priorities related to salmon, such as high-risk habitats or key at-risk stocks in specific geographic areas. And also the program is likely to complement the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative. The province has expressed an interest in increased support for community hatcheries and for particular species such as steelhead. So DFO will work with BC over the next coming months to determine what the investment priorities are going to be and the timelines for the next phases of the program should they come to fruition. We're on to the last slide, and I just wanted to say thank you very much for having me. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us at BCSHRIF. We would be pleased to have a discussion with you on your project, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you to the speakers and the facilitators. I know your presentations will have inspired some great questions and conversation. The link to the live question and answer is in the description below on your screen, and was also emailed to you on your agenda. Thank you all for attending SEP Community Workshop 2021, and we look forward to the watershed tours set for tomorrow afternoon. Thank you so much again to the planning team for your dedication and hard work. We couldn't have had this wonderful digital experience without you all. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Saturday And we will see you all tomorrow for the Sunday afternoon tours. Thanks again, everyone. And we'll see you at the next SEP workshop in 2 years from now in person. Can't wait.